And good afternoon, everyone. Well, again, it's a great pleasure to be here for a number of reasons. One of them, the fact that it's not the first time I am in an academic event with Sanjay Seth, but I think it's the first time I actually have the chance to discuss with him his work. So for me, it's a great honor and an opportunity that I'm going to take in a very selfish way, as you're going to see. Then I'm going to say that I agree with something that Elisa said, but I will disagree with another one. I don't really think I am the that I was an obvious choice to this, and this is the disagreement, of course. For several reasons. I mean, I teach theory of history, and of course, post-colonial theory is there. And actually, the text that I give to my students is Sanjay Seth's Reason or Reasoning, and I always find it very stimulating to discuss it in class. But as an historian, I always had I never managed to ingrain post-colonial theory in my own work, particularly on Portuguese nationalism. I always had it. I always had trouble considering or finding a satisfactory place of empire and colonialism in the discourse of Portuguese nationalism. But that's something that doesn't really that I shouldn't bring here. But it's a kind of relation from the outside, as someone curious, interested, as a reader. But someone that then, and this is the selfish approach that I'm going to have to this text, is going to try to take this opportunity to engage very closely with Sanjay Seth's text in order to gain something for myself. So I should have written, precisely because of the reasons Manuela said, because I am going to be very dull, I must warn you. The only reason that probably, the only aspect of the presentation that I suppose won't be so dull is that I actually going to read a lot from Sanjay Seth's texts. So I will read or I will follow my reflection very closely around quotations from Sanjay Seth. The thing I agree with Elisa was on a remark she made in the previous session about the the generosity, the openness, the intellectual position that is again both very generous, very open, and very coherent in the sense that doesn't try to replace a critique of theory by creating another theory that marks all of Sanjay Seth's writings. And so this is something that follows all texts in the book, but also I felt very strongly the several chapters of Beyond Reason. And there was again a moment in the early session when I think it was Marcus who addressed the question of the difference between methodology and theory, and I think that if I'm allowed to say this in these exact terms, in Sanjay Seth, methodology is always already theoretical, in the sense that it is through a certain kind of writing and reasoning that he creates, again, not a new theory, but a theoretical critique of grand theories that never end up crystallizing in another grand theory. And I think this is a move that Manuel also mentioned, and other colleagues in the earlier session. And I think this is very important. The texts never end with a theatrical conclusion. They are always calls to vigilance and to being attentive and to try to situate oneself in the field and in the discussions. And here, I must say that I feel a stronger affinity with what I think is Sanjay Seth's strong influence from post-structuralism, which is again also maybe or could maybe be read as a methodological gesture that creates a theoretical position. Well, so what I'm going to do, this presentation will follow some problems raised by Sanjay Seth in his work closely, as I said. It will gradually or tentatively enumerate 4 important aspects that seem to derive from one major question that is present in one way or another in the texts. And the question is that of modernity's self-positing, the ability or the power of modernity to self-posit itself. So starting to come close to this idea, to this problem. My first quotation comes from the text Changing the Subject. I think it's chapter 1 in the book. My argument, and now I'm reading Sanjay Seth, so it's his argument. My argument, however, is not about intention. My claim is not that the British, and we will see what the British are doing here later, my claim is not that the British sought to produce modern subjects, but rather that Western modern knowledge posits and presumes a certain subjectivity or type of selfhood, and that this is so irrespective of intentions. So I come to my first aspect that derive from this major question of modernity's self-positing. This pervasive quality of modernity, on the other hand, can be historically and geographically situated. So the geographical and historical situation of modernity's self-positing. And again, reading, and as I told you, I'm going to read a lot, from another chapter, is Thinking with Modernity Eurocentric. Sanjay Seth answers. The Eurocentrism this article is concerned with is not that born of a prior conviction of Europe's superiority. That would be too easy in some way, and these are my words. It is instead a consequence of an account which sees in the advent of modernity a profound historical rupture, a rupture which first occurred in Europe and arose out of forces and processes internal to European societies before being spread to other parts of the world. The knowledge through which we know of this rupture is itself a product of it. So that the categories through which we represent and characterize the emergence of newness are themselves part of that newness. I will repeat a couple of sentences that I already read in these 2 extracts. The ability, power of, now quoting again, modern knowledge to posit and presume a certain subjectivity, or, another quotation, already read, so a repetition, a knowledge through which we know of this rupture is itself a product of it. So this is, as I read it, Sanjay Seth's coming to terms with the initial problem, modernity's self-positing power. And this is what leads to Eurocentrism, which doesn't seem to be, at least not simply, a question of, and I'm now both paraphrasing and quoting, not simply a question of a prior conviction of Europe's superiority, again, this would be probably too simple, but a consequence of modernity itself. Closer to Sanjay Seth's analysis in his Thinking with Modernity Eurocentric, Eurocentrism is not so much the presumed uniqueness of Europe as the reason why modernity originated there, but the hypothesis that it is the rise of modernity in Europe that leads to the search for European distinctiveness. Again, the idea of modernity somehow retrospectively produces the knowledge about itself. It's the main methodological approach to the initial big question. So it's a question of knowledge, and this is the second aspect. Knowledge, then, or cognition, perception, rather than just historical supremacy or geographical conquest. So historical supremacy or geographical conquest will be our first aspect, and then we move to a somewhat more complex and deep aspect of the problem of modernity, that it is it consists mainly of a form of knowledge, of Western knowledge, to which I'm adding, but these are my words, forms of cognition or perception. So, repeating once again, so I'm not only quoting but repeating my quotations, as you can see. Repeating once again an already quoted expression, the knowledge through which we know of this rupture is itself a product of it, i.e., modernity's self-positing is more historiographical than historical. Sorry, I stammered there, so let me repeat this. The idea that the knowledge through which we know of this rupture is itself a product of it, i.e. that modernity is self-positing, it shows us that modernity is self-positing more than an historical phenomenon is a form of knowledge, in other words, is historiography. So the next quotation comes from exactly Reason or Reasoning, Clio or Siva. To call this humanism into question and to recognize that it is history writing that produces history rather than the fact of history that produces history writing. Remember, knowledge through which we know of this rupture is itself a product of it. So again, and this is very provocative, that's why I'm insisting, to recognize that it is history writing that produces history rather than the fact of history that produces history writing is to open thought to new possibilities. And I'm again now quoting Sanjay Seth, including the possibility of what we have is not man, the subject of history, who is then pluralized into so many different histories of man, but rather that from the outset we have men, different human societies that conceive of and relate to the past in multiple ways. Pasts that are not accessible to them or us, outside the codes and representational forms we use to represent them. So, more than ruling history and geography, aspect 1, then modernity in this sense is said to create historical consciousness, aspect 2 itself, or its narrative, that is, historiography, a specific form of knowledge about the past. This leads us to a further question. Modernity may be situated, historically and geographically, and it may be a specific form of knowledge about the past, but its pervasiveness, despite this situatedness and specificity, endows it with universalism. And universalism will be then my third aspect, deriving from the initial question of modernity. Universalism then. Self-posited not as a form of knowledge among others, a culture at the same time, a culture at the level of other cultures, so not doing that, but as a revelation, modernity becomes a discovery of truth. Let's again follow, as I said, from his text, his thinking with modernity Eurocentric that I also quoted before. Here, the core presumptions of modern knowledge are not yet another set of parochial assumptions claiming universal validity, like a proselytizing religion, but rather are embedded in an account that purports to explain both why we humans were once bound to get things wrong and how it became possible to get them right. This is what I have elsewhere characterized and criticized as the once was blind and now can see narrative that you can find actually in chapter 4 in this book. And continuing my reading of the quotation, this, I suggest, is more fundamental than the empirical claim that the features that constitute modernity first arose in Europe. Or rather, this is what underlies the empirical claim and what makes Eurocentrism so difficult wholly to escape. For if modernity is not a culture or a social imaginary like others, but rather what finally makes it possible to see what the world is really like, if it is not just another in a sequence of historic constructions, but rather the unveiling of what has been at the root of these constructions, then, he concludes, we cannot but privilege modernity. We cannot but privilege modernity, because modernity is what makes it possible to see what the world is really like. This claim underlies any empiricism. It presupposes the condition of knowledge, not the other way around, which makes it so difficult wholly to escape. Something I already read in as pasts that are not accessible to them or as outside the codes and representational forms we use to represent them, or in the knowledge through which we know of this structure is itself a product of it, so that the categories through which we represent and characterize the emergence of newness are themselves part of the newness. So if you bear with me for a bit longer, let me briefly pause and recapitulate. Modernity, in several moments of Sanjay Seth's analysis, is a powerful idea that self-posits its own logic. By doing so, it becomes an authoritative self-fulfillment of its own time and space. This authority is the authority of knowledge, visible for what interests us here in the narrative of historiography, and its history, or in history, that modernity becomes the revelation of an inescapable, irresistible truth that admits no variation or alternative, a universalism. This universalism, to resume the previous quotation, or to continue the previous quotation, necessarily engulfs all others that may exist in the time and space under its authority. And I'm quoting again. However much we may wish to be charitable in our understanding of others and endeavor to recognize that each age has its own worldview, our modern worldview is privileged. For we, unlike others, are no longer in thrall to enchantments and cosmologies, lacking the clear-eyed recognition of what the world is really like. So I here come to my fourth and last aspect, subjectivity. Actually, this idea that we, unlike others, are no longer in thrall to enchantments and cosmologies, lacking the clear-eyed recognition of what the world is really like, this is what actually the British, of course, from my first quotation, were doing, or how they presumed a certain subjectivity in their colonial rule. The presupposition of this subjectivity is probably the most decisive critique developed by Sanjay Seth in these texts. And here, it challenges another presupposition, or narrative, of modernity, that of freedom, or of modernity as a history of emancipation. One that may hit our enthusiasm with any of these narratives of emancipation, as my enthusiasm myself by many of these narratives of emancipation, or as Sanjay Seth's enthusiasm himself when he first read, for example, Marshall Berman's All That Is Solid Melt into Air, now submitted to a thorough critique in Chapter 6. So let me follow closely, and I'm getting to the end, and I'm going to follow closely the concluding remarks of Changing the Subject, the opening chapter of the book, to try to tackle this final discussion on subjectivity and modernity. I will be both paraphrasing and quoting Sanjay Seth. We follow a tradition coming from Rousseau and Kant, the French and American revolutions, to think of freedom not only as non-enslavement, but also more strongly as autonomy. This is the form of subjectivity presupposed by modern knowledge, active rather than passive. But we can think of a prior way of thinking about it, and that Sanjay Seth describes like this. But the first sense of freedom, he says, first both in the sense of being logically prior and historically earlier, is freedom in the sense of not being merged into the background, lost in nature, into nature, like animals and slaves, nomos rather than physis. The Greeks did not think all men possessed it, and thus this was not built into their very conception of what it meant, of what it means to be a human self. End of quotation. As modern selves, heirs to the bourgeois revolutions and to Kantian philosophy, we can acknowledge that the free, autonomous chooser of rights is not the only type of human that there has been, there is that not all other forms of selfhood have necessarily been the same. In other words, Seth, this constitutes our way of staying sensitive to difference. In doing so, we are thinking with Max Weber, and again, in Seth's words, we insist that those who lived in other times conceived of and inhabited the world in ways different to ours. And thus that understanding cannot be achieved by attributing our modern ways of thinking and being in the world onto other periods and peoples. The question is that if we must picture other humans who in turn picture the world in ways different from our own, we are inescapably led back to seeing the sense of self as a version of ours. Inescapably, because as we've seen before, modern knowledge underlies everything, and thus it's difficult to escape. Because this is probably the most complex and challenging moment in Sanjay's reflection, or at least that's how I felt it, I'm going to read a particularly long quotation and then try to oversimplify it. The subject who threatens, and this is again Sanjay Seth's words, the subject who threatens to merge into the world thus appears as very different from us. His difference lies in his adopting a stance toward the world that is one of merging. And merging here is a word that returns in my economy of quotations. The subject who attributes his agency to supernatural powers is again very different from us. His difference lies in his attributing his own beliefs and capacities to another. But like us, they too picture the world. They too endow it with meanings different from ours. And that being so, we are inescapably led back to seeing their sense of self as a version of ours, lacking only in self-consciousness. All subjects endow the world with meaning, but the modern subjects know that this is what we do. If we nonetheless declare that their way of looking at the world is as valid as ours, our intention is valid by the mode in which it is thought. Our commitment to difference remains embedded in intentions, while our categories, the grammar of our thought, lead us always into teleology and normativity. The best we can do is to be vigilant. But it is an unequal struggle, for we struggle to express one thing while our conceptual language leads us to say another. So, oversimplifying it, we seem to be accepting difference, but we are really imposing autonomy in a world that is one of merging. Here we have universalism working almost unconsciously, in Sanjay Seth's words. Again, if we nonetheless declare that their way of looking at the world is as valid as ours, our intention is valid by the mode in which it is thought. Not solving the problem, committing to being vigilant, is Sanjay Seth's limited, and precisely because of that, for what I said in the beginning, rigorous answer. And he finishes like this. I suggest that we need to search for ways by which we can think this difference without substantializing it into another subjectivity, and thereby bringing it under a category which erases with one hand the difference which it writes with the other. We need to search for forms of thought that allow us to recognize that there have been and are ways of thinking the world other than modern, Occidental ones, but also ways of thinking difference without invoking the subject and without setting into motion an anthropology which ceaselessly transforms humans into man. Among other things, and this is my conclusion, this will save us from one of modernity's most patronizing gestures, that of liberating the other. But this still leaves me with two questions, and these are really two questions that, if not now, I would like to have a chance to discuss with Sanjay. What if we were to think of this picturing the other in terms of another powerful modern political project? So we've been thinking about freedom here, mainly. So if the other powerful modern political project that we were using to think to picture this other was that of equality, how does equality, the presupposition of equality, deals with difference? I was actually, during the discussion before, thinking of a text on anachronism by Jacques Rancière, where he criticizes Lucien Febvre's book on Rabelais and incredulity in the 16th century, and basically questions how does one know, can be sure, that equality is not verifiable. So this would be my first question. The other thing, in a book that challenged me, interpolated me in many different ways, not least by the discussions that I didn't bring here on modernity and modernism around Marshall Berman, but also the narratives of Jameson. Where do we place romanticism in this picture of modernity? I think that maybe the answer was already given earlier this afternoon by saying that there is a continuity between, say, pre-modern and modern France. So not there was a radical separation there. But the non-separation, the world of merging, probably, I don't know, my hypothesis is that there's maybe the continuities are probably not as strong. So if we accept this hypothesis that the world of merging may have continued in a stronger way than what we tend to recognize, this would lead me to keep the question: where do we place romanticism in this picture of modernity? Wouldn't we be able to see romanticism as an experience of the world that is one of merging, precisely? What does romanticism do to modernity, basically? Could we somehow say that it is already a way of provincializing it? And this final question is maybe my effort to try to emulate what I think is Sanjay Seth's way of reasoning, or does this suggestion ends up reinforcing modernity's self-positing power as a kind of internal other, romanticism plus modernity, thus completing a heightened totality. So what's the relation? Is it a kind of reinforcement of modernity's totality, the fact that within European culture something like romanticism emerged? And I will stay there.